Um, I'm really interested in vocal timbre. You know, it's such an incredibly complex and also very musically important timbre producer. And in popular music, the vocal timbre can be very closely tied to things like brand and personality. And so oftentimes singers will carefully craft their vocal timbre to communicate an image. And there's a lot of research that that has shown that listeners are very adept at discerning things like age and weight, even things like physical size, just from listening to the the sound of someone's voice. Can you still see my screen? It says sharing is paused.
We can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think there's a really awesome opportunity to investigate vocal timbre in popular music in the music of Tom Waits. For those of you who aren't extremely familiar with Tom Waits, just a little bit of background about him. He is a very theatrical. There are a couple things that really strike most listeners about Tom Waits. He's very theatrical in the way that he presents himself. He's literally written 4 albums for theater music. He's also written a number of film soundtracks and has an extensive acting career of over 20 films. And as opposed to a lot of singer-songwriter artists who expresses a sort of autobiography, a lot of Tom Waits' songs are explicitly non-autobiographical. You know, Christmas Card from a hooker in Minneapolis is one example. And Mark Samples, in talking about one of his albums, has said that the entire album is an exercise in the development of fictional characters. So a lot of his music does things like this. The other thing, and probably the most recognizable feature of Tom Waits' music, is his vocal timbre, or maybe more specifically, his vocal timbres.
Josh, can I jump in? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're on your first slide, and I'm just wondering if that's intentional.
No, it's not. I think it's
okay.
Still, yeah, it says sharing is paused.
Okay, you might try backing out of screen share and starting it over again, and then and then pressing play on the slide deck.
Okay, 1 sec. It's funny how this always works in tech run through. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
It says sharing is paused again.
Can you advance to the next next slide?
I did, yeah.
It doesn't play when you play, actually.
There we go.
We are not on screen.
Sharing is paused.
Yeah, you are. We are seeing your the version where you have did some editing and everything. We don't see it as a slideshow.
Huh. It says bring your shared window to the front. You don't see any motion?
No.
Oh, goodness. Love tech. I don't know. Share screen.
Yeah, somebody said, try to start the slideshows and share afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later. It's not very reassuring.
You
Could
can't
we start the slideshow and then initiate the screen share?
That's what I just tried to do, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, goodness. Okay. There we go. Does that work?
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
We're in business.
And can you see motion now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay. So Tom Waits is very theatrical. I already talked about that. The second thing that strikes people about Tom Waits' music is his vocal timbre, or more specifically his vocal timbres. Solis has said it is common to the point of meaningless to say that Waits is possessed of a deep, gravelly, whiskey voice, What is more true is to say that he has a distinctive voice, but that it sounds profoundly different from one performance to the next. And later he mentions that multiple voices show up on a given album, and a particular voice may show up here and there throughout the years. Speaking of his own voice, Tom Waits has said, "I try my best to chug, stomp, weep, whisper, moan, wheeze, scat, blurt, rage, whine, and seduce. With my voice, I can sound like a girl, the boogeyman, a theremin, a cherry bomb, a clown, a doctor, a murderer. I can be tribal, ironic, or disturbed. My voice is really my instrument." I have 6 short clips here of different examples of some of Tom Waits's variety in his vocal timbre. The last clip, he actually switches from one timbre to another in the middle of the track. So.
What does it matter? A dream of love or a dream of life? When the moon is a cold chiseled dagger.
Okay, did you guys hear that? Hopefully, audio is working. I'll assume yes.
Audio is working. Yep.
Okay, great. The last thing I want to mention is the level of intertextuality in Tom Waits's music. A lot of his albums will reference, one track will reference other tracks, or even albums will reference other albums. And this is such a tightly constructed concept of the album for Tom Waits that oftentimes there are songs that he records that he just can't fit into the story. And there, over the years, have gotten to be so many of them that he put out an album called Orphans, which is what he calls those songs that kind of dangle. And talking about putting the album together, which is something like 60 tracks, Waits said it was almost impossible to sequence, a lot of disparate sources, and it made for this weird skyline. He said, "Kathleen and I wanted the record to be like emptying our pockets on the table after an evening of gambling, burglary, and cow tipping." And the sequencing was really tough, but ultimately he decided to organize it according to what he called brawlers, ballers, and bastards. 3 different albums, 3 different discs, each one with about 20 tracks, categorized into these different categories here. So what I want to do today is look at specifically this hypothesis that there is a relatively small number of perceptually distinctive character archetypes in Waits's vocal timbres, whose songs are marked by timbres that share a family resemblance and are differentiated from one another. So in order to do this, my first approach was to try to find masters of the original recordings and do some automatic feature extraction. But Tom Waits is notoriously reclusive, and every effort I made to try to contact him or his studio resulted in no contact and response. So I didn't have masters, and I couldn't isolate the voice. He has a huge output of albums, and so what I decided to do was to take just the albums from the second half of his career, starting in about 1983 with the album Swordfish Trombones. He has 146 vocal tracks across these albums. And I decided to sample just the first 5 seconds of each track, starting at the first vocal entry, with at least 80% of that 5 seconds consisting of the voice. There are a couple times that he would say, "all right," or something, and then there'd be more instruments for a while before he would start. So, and of course, 146 tracks is a lot. It's a huge repertoire. And so I couldn't ask participants to do the entire data set. So I had 40 excerpts randomly sampled per participant for each study. And the first phase was to sort these excerpts into different categories. I opted to do this instead of pairwise dissimilarity just because of the enormous, 5 seconds times 40 tracks, that would have been a huge study. So this was a way of getting around some of that, even though it's not quite as good of a data. Giordano et al. Argued that a truncated hierarchical sort, where you first divide it up into n divided by 5 categories, and then combine the categories until you've got only 2 left, can still retain quite a bit of information about categorization. And participants were instructed to ignore instrumentation, texture, genre, and words as meanings, and to focus only on the sound and the timbre of the voice. You know, the extent to which participants are able to do this, of course, is questionable, but and then the second phase after they sorted was to provide semantic labels for each category, so that I had some descriptions about how participants were thinking about the sounds. This is what the interface looked like. The 40 excerpts were scattered randomly across the top of the screen, and I asked participants to listen to all 40 first before doing anything. In fact, the screen locked out and they had to listen to all 40. And I asked them to consider the range of timbral variety that they heard before starting to sort. Once the 40 had played, they could click on any excerpt and hear it again as many times as they want, and then they could click and drag them down into one of the 8 groups below. Once this was completely done, I fed the groups back to the participants in random order, and they had to listen to all the tracks in each group and then provide a description of the vocal quality of the group. And then finally, the third stage was to listen to each group again with the descriptions on the groups, and then start merging them until there were only 2 that were left. I ended up with 134 college music majors, 73 from my last university, the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor, and 61 from Kent State University. I should note that the 61 Kent State University participants did this completely online because of COVID-19. And I ended up with 84 female and 50 male participants, and all the standard biographical data that you'd expect from this kind of population. I did ask them what the primary genre they listened to was, and 101 said rock music, 21 said classical, and 11 said jazz. And there are your gold MSI values for them. Okay, so let's look at the results here. So once I had all the data, I had some idea of distance measures between pairs of songs. And the distance measures were basically the number of times that 2 excerpts were grouped together divided by the number of times they could have been grouped together. So in other words, if let's say, you know, album A track 1 and album A track 2 showed up in 12 different participant interfaces, and they were grouped together all the time, then they would have a similarity of 1. And to find distance measures for clustering, I subtracted that from 1 to turn them into distance measures. If you look at the correlation matrix, which is giant, you'll see that there's a lot of variability here, as you'd expect with something like this. But you can see these little blue squares that suggest that there is some clustering, some differentiation between groups that are happening. Of course, model selection is an open question with something like cluster analysis. How many clusters do you actually have? There are a lot of ways of doing that. I chose to use a model-based clustering algorithm, and that suggested that the optimal number of clusters was 7. I sort of examined this a little further by looking at the silhouettes of the 7 clusters that the model suggested. And, you know, of course, there are a couple of excerpts that could have been grouped in other clusters, but in general, it looks like it's a fair clustering. The groups, I mean, the silhouettes aren't really tall, so there aren't very distinct identities of these clusters, but it looks like there is a reasonably 7 clusters going on. As another way of thinking about this or visualizing this, I stuck this into a Ward's method hierarchical cluster and asked it to color code it by 7 clusters, and this is what it came up with. You can see that there's probably some subclustering happening within those 7, and then some superclusters. You know, you could argue that there should be 3 clusters or something like that. If you look at this as a phylogenetic tree, you can see the clusters here color coded by the songs, and you can see some clusters are closer to each other than others. And another way of visualizing this would be the model-based clustering. So this is two factors that the model-based clustering algorithm pulled out of the data and plotted it. And you can see that there's a fair amount of segregation by cluster. And then finally, this is the 3D, a three-dimensional illustration of the clusters that you can see. So just a little bit more exploded. Okay, so taking the 7 clusters that I got from the model-based clustering, the next question was, what kinds of descriptors did participants provide to describe these things? The first thing I did was just look and see what kind of vocabulary I had for all the clusters at the same time. And you can see, this is really striking. The most common term far and away that people used to describe Tom Waits music was raspy. A full 10.56% of the tokens used were the word raspy. I should also mention that I cleaned up the data first, you know, eliminating basically everything that wasn't a descriptor of timbre. Most of the adjectives are retained, fixed spelling issues. If I had different forms of the same term, I would pick the one that was more common and change all the other ones to that term to try to see what kinds of patterns there are.
Josh, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just sorry to have to rush your drive to the cadence here, but in the interest of time, could you proceed to the conclusions?
Sure. Yeah, we'll do. Thanks. Sorry for all the technical issues. So here we have categories by. These are the terms by category, and I will just skip this process. You can see some distinctions here, and I took Zach's method of looking at, yeah, you know what, if we don't have time to dig into this, we won't. And so basically, in conclusion, yeah, there are 7 clusters here, and there are likely many relevant subcategories. There is a singer-specific timbre lexicon that we can get from this data, and there are significant differences in qualitative descriptions of the 7 categories, which is consistent with the presence of a few timbral categories. I'm hoping to do some to look at the analytical implications of this by looking at how he pulls the same characters to express similar things, and looking for possibly even extending this to look at the differences within and between singer timbral variety for other singers. And so we could look at how much variability there is in singers' presentation. So, okay, that we'll just call it there. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I apologize for having to rush you through at the end. This is clearly a very rich topic, and there's much to discuss.